Hi guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum, and we're going to do something a little bit out of the ordinary today, and we're going to take a look at gold damascening. This is a form of firearms embellishment, not unlike engraving, but done totally differently than engraving. And it's a form of embellishment that isn't very well known today and is kind of geographically limited to the Spanish. They're really the only people, with a little bit of exception. There's some of this being done in India and Japan as well, but primarily the Spanish, especially when it comes to firearms. Now, damascening actually has its origins back in like the 13th century, and it was originally done to armor and weapons, as well as all sorts of other objets d'art, vases, jewelry boxes, anything that you wanted decorated could be damascened. So the question is, what is gold damascening? Because to the untrained eye, it just looks like some other form of gold inlay or gold engraving or something that's too fancy for any of us to be able to actually afford to buy, right? Well, damascening it's unique in the way that it's actually applied. So what you do to damascene a gun is you first take a gun in the white, unfinished, so just raw frame and slide and whatever other parts you're going to do. And by the way, this is occasionally done to long guns, shotguns, fowling pieces, that sort of thing. But especially these days, or in its heyday, 1800s, 1900s, vast majority of the damascening of guns was revolvers and semi-auto pistols. Anyway, you take the gun in its raw form, unfinished, and this is typically done by the gun factory. They'll have a gun in production and they'll contract out a damascening job, a special order, to an artisan who will take the semi-finished gun and then finish it through this process. So you start with the gun, and you literally, the first thing you do is scratch the bejesus out of the frame. And not really in a chaotic way, but you would take the end of a file or a very sharp knife specifically made for doing this sort of thing, and you're going to cut grooves in the gun in like 3 separate directions, all overlaid. And the purpose of this is just to roughen the surface. So if we take a look here, you'll see exactly what's happening at a microscopic view. You're taking a smooth surface and you're turning it into a bunch of sharp ridges, because when you cut a groove in the metal, what you're actually doing is pushing that metal up, and so you get a depression in the middle where the blade was, and then you get 2 peaks on either side. And by doing this, you're kind of turning the surface of the metal into Velcro. Think of it like the hook side of Velcro. Then, once that's all done, you're going to take gold foil or gold wire, and you're going to hammer it down onto the surface of the gun. And the gold, being very soft, is going to act like the hook side of a sheet of Velcro. And the gold will mush onto these peaks and valleys that you've created on the surface of the steel, and it will adhere itself actually in a very firm and tenacious way to the surface of the gun. So we have a little bit of a demonstration of that right here. Once you have that on, you're then going to use a hammer and punch, and you're actually going to punch the gold down. That smooths it a bit, and that also is going to push over some of those steel peaks and help finish the adherence of the gold to the steel. So this technique works really well to make a smooth surface to the gun that's flush with the original steel. The gold that we're talking about using here is only a couple microns thick, 5 or 6 microns. That's 5 or 6 thousandths of a millimeter. This is really, really thin gold. And because it's that thin and thus that light, this sort of Velcro-like adherence works really well. However, if you want to have a look where you've got the gold really elevated above the level of the gun, that requires using much thicker gold, and this damascening process doesn't work quite so well. So instead, what you do for that technique is much more akin to today's inlaying. You would cut a series of basically dovetail grooves into the surface of the gun, and this is on a very small scale, and then you take strips of gold and hammer them into those dovetail joints. Because the gold is very soft and malleable, it will squish itself into those dovetails, and then that's like half of the gold goes into the dovetail, and the remaining amount stays on the surface, and assuming you have the gold thick enough and the grooves close enough together, when you hammer that flat, all the independent pieces of gold will spread out, come to touch, and form a continuous surface. And that allows you to have elevated embellishment. Now I want to think about, before we go on, let's think about how this is actually physically done by the artist doing the work. You have to actually have a stable surface to work on. You're taking little tiny pieces of gold and little tiny punches and a hammer and tapping them in really ornate geometric patterns. So how do you hold all this stuff in place, especially maybe not just a pistol frame, but some of the weird shaped parts? How do you do this on the top of a curved pistol slide? Well, the answer is they take wooden blocks that are nice and square on the outside, and you kind of just adhere, you glue the metal piece onto one of these wooden blocks using a resin called pichia. It's a reddish, old-timey recipe sort of resin. And then you secure the wood block, which now has your part glued to it, in what's called a ball vise, which is basically a big iron sphere that sits in a triangular cradle, and it has a clamp, and you can clamp your wooden block into this. And what the sphere does is it allows you to rotate this part into pretty much any orientation so that you can work on it. And this thing's like 30 pounds of iron, and that's enough mass that you can be tapping on this thing with a hammer and punch and it won't actually move. However, when you need to change your orientation to work on a different surface, you can just physically turn the thing. So really a pretty clever system. Once you're done with the piece of work, all you have to do is heat up your resin and it will melt away and release the part. Pretty slick. Now, here's the next question. I mentioned that you start with a piece of steel, a gun frame or slide or whatever other part, in the white, unfinished. Well, you have to blue it somehow, or else whatever isn't covered in gold is going to rust pretty quickly, and that's not going to look good. If you think about this, remember the reason that gold is such a valued item, or one of the reasons, is that it doesn't tarnish. It is chemically inert more than almost any other decorative metal that we have. What you do once you have this, once you have your damascening done, is you take the whole part, gold and all, and drop it in a bluing tank. You can't do rust blue, but something like a salt blue today will blue the steel, and it basically does nothing at all to the gold. That's the whole point of gold. It's inert. It does dull the gold a little bit. And so what happens is once you've got the design done, you blue the whole gun, and that gives you a nice background finish and prevents corrosion to the gun after it's leaves and is out in the world. Then you bring the gun, the partially finished gun or gun part back out, and that's when you go back and what they call the reposado, going over all the work a second time, and with another series of punches. And these are the artist will have differently shaped punches. Some will have a pinprick in the center, maybe a concave surface or a convex surface, or a solid line. You're using these punches to create further embellishment in the gold itself, or to remove embellishment. If you just want to smooth out the surface of, say, a wider piece of gold foil that you've added to the gun, you have specific punches to do that. After the gun's blued, you go back through and basically put a final finish on all the gold with this series of punches. That's going to remove working marks from before, and it'll get rid of the little bit of dulling that you get from dunking this gold gun into your bluing solution. In total, this process is going to take a lot of time. Depending on the quality, and we'll talk about quality and how to assess it in a minute. Depending on quality, you're looking at, for the really crap end of the scale, a week maybe of an artist's time, full-time, 40-hour work week on a single gun. At the other end, when you get to the really magnificently good damascening, you're talking several months, 4, maybe 5 or 6 months to do a single firearm. And that's when they look really spectacular. So let's talk briefly about where this process actually came from in the modern period. Because there's really one guy and his father that are credited with creating this renaissance of damascening in Spain in the 1800s. And that is a guy named Placido Zuloaga and his father Eusebio Zuloaga. Now Eusebio was the armorer to the king at the time. He lived 1808 to 1874. And he, of course, as armorer to the king, ran a workshop and did damascening as an engraving technique. And his son, Placido, wasn't so much interested in firearms, but was very much interested in damascening. And so Placido tended to do mostly non-gun items, but was responsible for damascening really becoming much more popular in Spanish society. So what we have here is a powder flask that was actually done by Placido Zuloaga. And he didn't sign very much. In fact, it's a little bit unusual in that damascening artists in general in Spain don't often sign their work. So you'll almost never find a gun that's actually autographed by its artist. It's kind of unique to find an object like this that is. Anyway, what I want to point out on this is that the damascening here is really, it's a backdrop to the real art on this, which is the relief engraving. So if we look at this up close, you can see that what they've done is used stippled gold leaf adhered to the metal in the bottom of the surfaces. So it forms a gold background to provide a nice relief to all of this really nice engraving. And that was the style early on. And we can see a firearm example of that style here. This is an 1860 production Lefacho pinfire revolver made by Orbea Hermanos, and it's got this exact same type of damascening. Here on the cylinder and the frame, you can see that they've done really nice relief engraving and then used gold leaf damascened onto the backdrop to give it some contrast. And inscribe their name in very large letters on the top of the barrel. Now we do also see here on the side what damascening would, before long, what would turn into the dominant style of damascening. And that is this flat, intricate work rather than just being a backdrop to relief engraving. Now this is an example of what would become the more dominant form, or a more dominant form, of firearms damascening. This is another Lefacho pinfire revolver, and this one actually is a gun that is signed by Eusebio Zuloaga, who was armorer to the king. And this particular piece was actually a presentation gun for the war minister of Catalonia. And man, let's just get a close-up of this. This is honestly one of my favorites of all the guns we're going to be looking at today. Actually, first off, let me point out that at this point in time, they were typically using ebony grips, relief engraved. This would change to often mother-of-pearl grips before too much longer, but ebony was a pretty good material to work with. All right, so we can see a bunch of things going on here. What you see in this is exquisitely high-quality damascening. All of this work is done with gold wire, and that's really an indicative point of high-quality work. Leaf or foil tends to be something that is done on lower quality damascening. Wire is what really requires artisan skill. So you can see all of this was laid out geometrically, and it all fits, and it's all nice and parallel and straight. You'll also notice that there are a variety of colors in here, and that can be done by using a mixture of materials. So not just gold wire, but sometimes silver wire as well. And then you'd also get various different alloys of gold. You could get white golds, green golds, red golds, and mixing these elements together allowed you to have all sorts of different looks to the piece. A damascened gun, in theory, when you ordered a gun to be damascened, you could choose how much coverage you actually wanted, similar to engraving, where you can choose, do you want 10, 20, 30, 50, or 100%? How much of the gun do you want covered? The more you have, the more costly it will be, but the more ornate it will look. Damascened guns tend to be 100% coverage. It's just a style that lends itself more to complete coverage than partial. And we can see here that extends to the back of the recoil shields. Even the underside of the hammer spur is ornately decorated. In this case, the name of the Catalonian war minister has been damascened into the rear strap of the grip. Even the grip cap there has just fantastic work done on it. Next thing I want to point out is that with Spanish damascening, there are two predominant styles that you'll find. One is an A-bar style, and one is a Toledo style. So one kind of a northern Spanish motif, and one more from central or southern Spain. And the A-bar, we have an example here of an A-bar. This is a copy of the Russian Nagant revolver made by Orbea Hermanos, and this was actually presented to a General Vasily Rodeanu, who was Romanian Minister of War and visited A-bar in 1915 looking to do some military procurement, and they gave him this magnificent damascened revolver. This is done in the A-bar style. And so it's going to be kind of, think of it as Renaissance Christian influenced, where you have a lot of scroll work. You'll have birds, dragons, dogs' heads maybe, animals, and vines and scrolls. And that's kind of the predominant motif on this gun, and that's typical of A-bar. The other major school of decoration is Toledo. It's more southern in Spain, and it has much more of the Moorish, Arabic, Muslim influence. And the way that that manifests is very intricate geometric forms, and also sometimes archaeological, or sorry, not archaeological, architectural motifs. We'll take a look at another one in a minute that has, for example, a really cool pattern or a picture basically from the inside of the Alhambra Palace. Now, on the Toledo gun here, and this is, by the way, an Astra 3004E, which is Astra's factory code for a Model 3000 that is damascened and has metallic grips. We'll get to the metallic grips in just a moment. This one, you'll see this repeating very fine geometric pattern. And this gun actually was presented to the Nicaraguan ambassador to Spain in, I think, the 1950s. So it has a Nicaraguan crest on it here. This one, we'll take a close look in just a moment. This has a Romanian crest on it. That was something also fairly typical of damascened guns, is usually if there was a grip escutcheon or an area for a logo, it would be either the national crest of the purchaser, whether they were government or civilian, or perhaps the initials of a private buyer. So let's take a closer look at some of the detail on this, the A-bar pattern of damascening. You can see that there's a dragon in here in between some of the scrolls. And by the way, just look at the fine lines there on the front sight. That is a definite indicator of high quality. And there's not a whole lot of gold leaf or foil that's used on this. There aren't a lot of large surface areas, with the exception of things like these animal forms, which are very nicely detailed. Here is our Romanian crest. And then they have a specific call out to the general that it's being presented to. The floral detail continues even on the front strap here. And we will see the animal motifs repeated in these forms on the cylinder. So that is kind of a stereotypical example of an A-bar style of damascening. Now, if we look more closely at the Toledo style, which I have to be honest is my preference, I think these look magnificent. You have geometric forms here that are immaculately laid out and then finished. And you'll notice some of this is shaped and some of it is stippled. The lines of punch marks in the center of these patterns, that's done with a stippling punch after the gold has been damascened onto the gun. So the artistic elements here are a combination of patterned wire and also surface finish with this stippling. There's the Nicaraguan crest. And then we have more repeated geometric patterns. One other element that you will typically find on damascened guns is that the markings will be moved. The guns that are ordered, that are chosen to be damascened, are typically taken off the production line before they received their final markings. So, for example, on this, there should be an Astra logo right here on the top of the barrel. However, that's a really convenient place to put some very nice embellishment. So they left the marking off of there, and they put it on the back strap of the gun instead, or the back of the frame right here. Now, in this case, the manufacturer's markings have been left where they normally would be, because that's a reasonably convenient place anyway with this particular make of pistol. But fairly commonly, if you have a pistol that normally would have a big slide legend on the side, that legend will be moved somewhere else to make room for engraving or for damascening instead. I said I would talk about the metallic grips, and we're going to do that right now. This is an Astra 800 pattern gun, and you'll notice that this thing is completely covered in Toledo style geometric patterning damascening. And we talked about how the surface preparation is to take the metal and score it up to roughen the surface to apply gold. How do you do that to like a wood or a plastic grip? Well, the answer is you don't. If the grips are damascened, they have special metallic grips that are put on specifically for this purpose. So that's a steel grip or grip panel. And this is just a magnificent example of artisan skill in doing damascening. I mean, most people couldn't draw this, much less create it in hammered on gold. You can see the same thing around the front of the barrel here. The level of detail on this gun is actually so fine that my camera can't even focus close enough to really show you all of it. Notice, in this case, they did actually leave that Astra logo there on the top front of the barrel. Now that you've seen some examples of gold damascening, let's take a look at what makes good gold damascening as opposed to crummy gold damascening, because there is a difference. Now, to just the untrained eye, these all look like very shiny gold pistols. In fact, this one has actually been on the cover of a major national gun magazine because it's a really shiny gold pistol, despite the fact that of all the guns in this particular display and set, of all the guns you're going to see today, this is without a doubt the worst one. And by the time we're finished with this segment, you'll understand why. Okay, this is a Star MMS, and it is a magnificent specimen of damascening. So let's just, honestly, it's all gorgeous. Let's just look at the grip panels. So what makes really good damascening is the level of detail. And an easy way to assess this is, first of all, look to see if all the lines are straight and square. I mean, just looking at this box right here, those corners are perfect, sharp 90-degree corners. That's a sign of quality. And then look at how much of the work was done with very thin wire as opposed to gold leaf or foil. It's much faster and easier to apply a big piece of foil than it is to use wire. For example, and this doesn't say anything bad about the quality of this gun, but on this area where the gun's markings are, this is just a piece of foil that's been hammered on and smoothed out. That can be done very quickly. Covering this same area with this style of scroll work takes an immensely longer amount of time. So if you see a gun with a lot of flat gold area, that's a sign of, well, generally of lower quality damascening. It's when a lot of the gun has been covered with elaborately fine, detailed wire work. That's top quality, best possible damascening. And here's your reward for sitting through this section. Take a look at that. Holy cow. This thing is fractally gorgeous. The closer you look at any given part, the more impressive it gets. Okay, now we're going to move to intermediate level damascening. This is still really good, but it's not up to the same level. So this is an Astra 4000 pattern, and let's take a closer look. So what we see here is really good detail, but not as much fine wire work. So this circular border, for example, is a pretty wide piece of foil that's been added, and it's had these detail punches added into it. That is a much faster process and a much easier process than adding individual lines of wire like they have on the inside of it. A figure like this, it's very well formed and very detailed. Look at that. You can even see the toes in the rear foot. And then the stamped markings that have been added make it look much more lifelike. You can see curvature lines here for the rib cage. You can see curvature lines here for fur on the back. The hair has styled lines to it. The wings have visible feathers. And this even has, it's a little hard to tell in this video, but this even has some highlights of red gold. The feathers in the wings here are actually red gold highlights. That flower is a red gold highlight, as are these flowers. This bird, again, this is This is a piece of gold foil that would have been cut out as a solid piece and hammered on, and that's a pretty easy process. But what brings this up from simplistic damascening to intermediate is the level of stamped on detail afterwards. It's very lifelike looking. Now, if we look at some of the other areas on this pistol, we'll see the same sort of thing. These bands, especially this front one that's just plain, and then even these two, this is a pretty simple thing to add compared to something like we saw on that first pistol. These are wide flat bands. They go on a little bit of stamping and you're done. These floral engravings, again, they're large flat pieces, fairly easy to apply, but then they've been given center veins in each of the leaves, and the stamping that was added afterwards was really well done. So all of that makes this a pretty good example of intermediate level damascening. So again, for comparison's sake, fantastic, just outstandingly good on the left, and pretty darn good on the right. And now we have what is honestly kind of crappy damascening. This was done quickly. It still looks like gold, but once you've seen really good damascening, you'll recognize that this is really kind of disappointing. So this is an Astra A60. It is in fact the only Astra A60 that Astra ever had damascened, but we can start by looking at some of these large surface areas that are just covered in flat, plain, unembellished gold. That's really easy. That almost might as well be plated, which requires no artisan effort at all. Then, when we look at the work on the side of the slide here, you'll see not only there's very little wire work, this is mostly pre-cut pieces of foil, and the level of detail is disappointing. So there are no center veins in any of these leaves. These flowers don't really look like flowers. They're not symmetrical. There's no lifelike pattern to them. They've been stippled, sort of, but that's about it. You can compare that flower to that flower, and you can really see the difference. This is really good. That's really bad. And then if you really want to see top quality, you can look at this one on the far left. Takes the whole thing one step further. So, excellent here, intermediate here, poor here. We can see further evidence of this by looking at the muzzles. That's another good point of comparison. All of this surface area is just gold leaf with no embellishment. And then there's just a little bit of stippled, circular punches on the front of the slide there. Our intermediate gun has much more detailed work on that muzzle ring. In fact, I even have to zoom in so that you can see it properly. These loops are each made of 2 lines of gold wire hammered down next to each other. That takes skill and time and effort to do. And then once again, our MMS here really provides the gold standard, no pun intended, with an even more intricate pattern on the barrel bushing. So you may be thinking, if at this point in the process you've started by just scratching the bejesus out of the gun, what do you do if there are large sections of blued finish left on the gun afterwards? How do they smooth that out? The answer actually is they don't. The scoring is fine enough that the bluing kind of just makes it into a matte surface. And this Orbea Hermanos 1884 revolver is an excellent example of that. I don't even know if my camera can quite focus in enough detail. There you go. Just in the light, you can see the patterns of cross-hatched scratches on the gun, because this particular damascening pattern has a lot of black space left in it. I think it looks pretty cool, and it gives us a perfect opportunity to see what that leftover blued surface looks like when there's a lot of it available. While we have this gun out, I also want to show you the grips. These are amazing. These are mother of pearl grips, and into them has been engraved the Argentine military crest. This gun was presented to an Argentine military officer. I don't know the exact details of it, but man, that's just really cool on those grips. And the other side is almost even more impressive, floral work. Now this is an example of a thoroughly abused damascened pistol. Why do we have this in with all of these gorgeous guns? Well, this is a great way to answer a question that I'm sure some people have. Namely, can you even like shoot these things? You know, do you have to worry about breathing on them too hard lest all of this gold just flake off or something? And the answer is, well, yes and no, but mostly yes. These guns are actually a lot more durable than you might expect. This is an example of one that has been routinely shot and handled and used, and while it's clearly seen better days, a lot of that gold is still in place. The adherence between the gold and the scratched up steel frame underneath is really pretty darn good. And in fact, what's more interesting is these are not really susceptible to impact as a type of wear. So you can shoot a Damascene gun really quite a lot. The act of shooting doesn't really do any damage potentially to the Damascening. What does potentially damage them is rubbing, so wear over time. So for example, on this one, you can see, yeah, especially on this side, this guy was probably right-handed, and this is the first thing that hits a holster or a case whenever he puts the gun away, and that has rubbed all of the gold off. All the highlights of the gold have been taken off on the back strap because that's where the hand is rubbing all the time when you're shooting the gun. But on these other areas that don't have much actual hand contact, the gold's pretty much intact. So shooting them, yeah, you can shoot them. You don't really have to worry about it. Excessive handling does potentially damage the thing over a lot of time, and especially rough handling. You do have to be careful cleaning these guns. What you don't want is to be rubbing this with a cloth and have a piece of the cloth catch on, say, a loose edge of a piece of gold and start to try and pry it up. That can really damage the Damascening. So the traditional, this is kind of funny, the traditional way to clean a gold Damascened gun is actually to dab oil onto it and then use, believe it or not, white breadcrumbs on the surface to absorb the oil and then just blow off the breadcrumbs. So rather than trying to wipe the thing down, you just do that. Now this gets a little more complicated if you have mixed silver and gold Damascening, because the silver, of course, will tarnish over time in a way that the gold doesn't. And I don't actually know what the best way would be to try and polish the silver elements of a Damascened gold gun like that. But this particular one, here's an example of kind of your worst case scenario. The gold doesn't shake off when you shoot it, but too much handling will damage them over time. And before people ask, too much handling does not include the very small amount of handling that I'm doing for this video. Okay, and before we wrap this up for good, I want to show you what is probably the most impressive Damascene gun you'll ever run into, and that is an Astra 902. The thing is big and impressive just as a regular pistol, and even more so as a Damascened pistol. So this was the 20-round extended magazine semi-automatic version of the Astra 900 series of broom handle lookalikes, and this one has been engraved. This was actually prepared for the King of Egypt, King Farouk, by a Damascener by the name of Adolfo Santos in Eibar, and made in Eibar, although this is engraved very much in the Toledo style. Here on the magazine well, we have some of this geometric patterning that is typical of Toledo. And then this is a view from inside the Alhambra Palace, another typical Toledo element. We've got some more of this patterning. Another cool little palace view right up there on the side of the slide. Geometric patterning here. You'll notice, as impressive as this looks, the amount of very fine scroll work on it is actually a little bit less than on that star MMS that we looked at earlier. Now, another element that you will see repeated in a lot of Toledo style of Damascening is this phrase. This is an Arabic inscription, kind of stylized, that translates to "there is no victor but God," and we'll see that repeated in a couple places on this pistol. Here on the slide, and we can also see it out here on the barrel. of a long, smooth, plain gold area on the top of the barrel. And then more patterning and another palace view on the left side of the magazine well. As I noted before, maker's markings are often relocated on Damascene guns. And this is a good example. Normally you would have Astra markings in a couple of lines here on the side plate. And they've just shrunken them down and moved them all to the very bottom of the side plate there, where they're kind of out of the way. Well, I hope you guys have enjoyed this look at a little known and little understood form of firearms embellishment. These guns are out there, but you know what? They're really rare. This is part of why they're not well understood. When you look at the companies that were typically doing damascening, you're talking about Spanish companies. So in the more modern era, you're talking about Astra and Star and Llama. And then, of course, the Spanish companies that existed before the Spanish Civil War. So companies like Orbea Hermanos and the multitude of other Spanish arms makers in Eibar. Those guys tended to manufacture, well, Damascene guns were always special order. Early on, you're talking about 3 times the cost of a standard gun to have damascening done, where engraving would be 50 to 100% extra. So damascening is about the most expensive thing you can do to a gun. Too expensive and too time-consuming for these companies to actually stock damascened guns. Now, they'd wait for you to order one, and then they'd pull one off of the production line and send it to an artist to be embellished. Now, that like 3-to-1 price ratio escalated as labor costs increased over time. By the 1950s, you're looking at more like 6 times the standard cost of the pistol to order an embellished damascened gun. And today, values tend to be, and this is a total generalization, but like 10 times the cost of the standard gun. So this has only gotten more expensive, and that's part of why it's kind of fallen out of favor a bit. Now, that being said, production of damascened guns tended to be right about 1 in 10,000. So if you had a gun where the factory made 200,000 of them, you would expect there to be about 20 special ordered as damascened guns. And that's not very many. So it makes sense that not a lot of people have seen very many damascened guns. So now, hopefully, the next time you see one in a museum, or better yet, on a gun show table, you'll actually have some idea of its relevance, and you'll be able to assess what was the quality of this work. Yeah, it looks shiny, but does it look shiny and high quality, or does it look shiny and low rent? So hopefully you enjoyed the little educational tour. If you did, please do consider checking out my Patreon page. It is people who support me there at $1 a month, people just like you, who make it possible for me to travel and bring you guns like this that I don't think you're going to find very many other places. If you can't afford to do that, I totally understand. Share the videos, enjoy the information, and thank you very much for watching.